So our next topic is solving genetics problems with a Punnett square, and you're gonna see the word monohybrid. So Mendel's principles stated that some alleles can cover up or hide the other allele. So we talked about those terms being dominant and recessive. And the word phenotype describes how something physically appears, and genotype is how it actually is the gene. Since we can't show what the gene actually looks like, we use a capital letter to represent the dominant allele, and we use a lowercase letter to represent the recessive allele. The idea is that when a parent makes sperm or eggs, their genes separate. So the gametes only have one of the pair. So when you have these 3 pairs of chromosomes, you can see them here, the possible gametes are only going to have half of that information. And you'll notice that there's these different combinations. And that's what we were getting to when we talked about meiosis, all of these different possible scenarios that could create different offspring. It creates a lot of genetic variation. So we have to talk a little bit about a math term, probability. So observed is what actually happens, and expected is what could happen. You're going to see this rule of multiplication, and I don't want you to panic, but it's just the idea of calculating what's likely that 2 events are going to happen in a row. You maybe even have done this at home. You flip a coin and you have a chance of getting heads. The next time you flip a coin, you also have a chance of getting heads. So it's multiplying 1/2 by 1/2, or 1/4. Notice the word we use and here, and that kind of gives us this hint that this is something that we can do. We can kind of figure out what's the chances of something happening. So there, in genetics, one way to try to figure out or predict the results of a genetic cross, if things are simple, they're not always simple, but in the case in biology, we're going to use some simple examples. You can use something called a Punnett square, and it can be used to predict what might happen. So for a monohybrid cross, mono means 1. So for a 1 trait, we look at 1 trait at a time. You start with a 4-square Punnett square. Then the next step is you place the alleles of the parents' gametes on the outside. So for example, if this is your cross, a capital T, lowercase t, that's mom, and a dad, lowercase t, notice I drew the egg and I drew the sperm. So you're going to put mom over here on this side, and you're going to put dad right here. The gametes are going to segregate, which shows you what would happen during meiosis. So now we're crossing a tall plant with a short plant. The next step is to fill in the boxes. I always recommend, if there's a capital letter, to put that first. So capital T, lowercase t, then you very carefully, this is where you don't want to make any silly mistakes, carefully include the next 2 letters, the 3rd square, and then finally the 4th square. The fun starts now when you have to summarize the results. So what do you have? And you just you can do tally marks, and remember, capital T means it's going to be tall. So when we look at this first, there's going to be 1 possibility of a tall. Down here, we got a short, a tall, and then a short. So when we put the genotypes, which would be what the genes might be, you'll notice you have 50% could be capital T, lowercase t, which is 1/2, or 50% might be short. In this case, the phenotype, how it physically looks, is exactly the same, 50-50. That's not always the case, but in this example, it is. So just a reminder that a genotype is what genes or letters the organism has. So we use these capital T, lowercase t. We talk about these terms. This is homozygous. Homo means same. They're both dominant. These alleles are heterozygous or hybrid. These are homozygous. They're homozygous recessive. And again, the phenotype is what it looks like. So if we really want to step back, when we look at the genotype, this is a picture of DNA, and DNA segments of these this DNA codes for a particular phenotype, makes something look the way it is. Now, if a letter is not given to you in a word problem, just make sure you are going to pick a letter that's easy to tell the difference, like A's or D's. Sometimes when you use P's and S's and W's, it's hard to tell the difference between a capital and a lowercase. So here's a problem that I want you to draw this cross on paper and try to do on your own. And you can pause the video after I read the problem and you can try to solve it yourself. All right, in humans, tongue rolling is a dominant trait. Those with the recessive condition cannot roll their tongues. Bob can roll his tongue and is heterozygous. Sally cannot roll her tongue. What is the probability their firstborn will not be able to roll their tongue? So we got to talk about what's important here, and we want to get to the parents. Bob can roll his tongue. Okay, so we know tongue rolling is going to be dominant. So Bob is either going to be this capital T, or lowercase, capital and lowercase. Sally cannot. So we know what her genotype is going to be right away. So I like to sometimes encourage you to underline the key important things. So I just want to point out, it does tell you here, Bob is heterozygous. So if you haven't paused the video and tried to solve that yet, I want you to do that now. And I'm going to follow through and I'm going to show you the answers. So you should have had Bob as heterozygous and Sally is homozygous. When you combine their offspring, possible offspring, you will notice that there is the chance that two of them are big T, little t, and two are little t, little t. So what's that mean? Well, it means that two of them are going to be able to roll their tongue like Bob, but two of the offspring might have the chance that they can't roll their tongue. Now, Bob and Sally don't have 4 children. It just says, what's the probability that their firstborn will not be able to roll their tongue? So if we look at the probability, get back here, it's going to be a 50% chance that their firstborn child is not going to be able to roll their tongue. Now, if they have a second child, the odds are going to still be the same. This one, you have 50% chance that that child's not going to be able to roll their tongue. And that's where you start to see, though, if they have 3 children or 4 children, eventually you would think that somewhere along the line, the laws of probability would have the child that can roll their tongue. So that's just one example of how to use Punnett squares to solve problems. You're going to also see some examples sometimes where you want to work backwards. Sometimes we only know about the offspring, and we're going to try to figure out what the parents' genotypes might be from the information we have about the offspring. So you kind of start in the center of the Punnett square in one of the 4 squares. Sometimes we do something called a test cross, is that when we have an organism that has a dominant phenotype, like Bob, but it told us he was heterozygous. But if it didn't tell us he was heterozygous, then we wouldn't know for sure if it was heterozygous or homozygous. You can't always tell somebody's gene. You can't tell somebody's genes by looking at something. So you would do something called a test cross, where you take a homozygous recessive organism and you cross them with the parent. And this is what Gregor Mendel did. This is how he figured out all of his information from his pea plants. So it's going to be time to do some practice problems. But before we do that, a few things to make sure you have down in your notes. All right, so I'm going to have you pause, and then I'm going to go over the answers. All right, number 1, the passing of traits from parents to offspring is known as heredity. Father of genetics is Gregor Mendel. Genes are located on chromosomes. Number 4, every gene is made of 2 alleles, which is letter B. Number 5, the organism's outward appearance, such as wrinkled seeds, are referred to as the A phenotype. And I have a few more questions for you to try. Number 6, the letters RR represent the B genotype. Number 7, they have 2 different alleles. The answer is B, heterozygous. Number 8, same alleles, is A, homozygous. Number 9, this would represent Mendel's parent generation. It's going to be C, capital R, lowercase r, because his parent generation were pure breeding or true breeding. Number 10, when two different alleles occur together, such as big R, little r, the one that is expressed is going to be the dominant trait. One last question. What is this diagram called? Hopefully you answered Punnett square. And what does this letter actually represent? These up here is what it's pointing to. On the outside, that's representing the parents. On the inside, you should say the offspring. All right, so you will have some practice problems and quizzes to try out, and you want to make sure that you give it your best shot.